For over 200,000 years, man survived without video games. Once that changed, the world was never the same again.
It's me, Mario!
This is the story of everything that happened next.
In just the last few years, video games have become a sport unto themselves, with teams, magazines, competitions, leagues, and all the traffic.
In just 50 years, the video game industry has evolved from tiny dots on a radar screen to fully immersive 3D graphics that rival today's biggest Hollywood blockbusters. Video games have done more than entertain us. They have changed the way we interact with machines forever.
Shouldn't you go out and socialize with your friends?
I quit soccer to play Atari.
From the moment she wakes up, Violet Bolton can't wait to get on her iPad.
Whether they are challenging, inspiring, comforting, or addictive, they have taken our lives to the next level. But back in 1962, it was a privilege to have access to the computer labs at the University of Utah, where aspiring computer engineers would gather in the middle of the night to play a brand new thing they called Space War. Space War made a huge impression on a young student named Nolan Bushnell.
A friend said, "Come over to the computer lab, I got something to show you." And so I went over at midnight, and we went in and played Space War, and I was addicted.
The future founder of Atari, Bushnell has been called the father of the modern video game. But while in college, he spent his summers working at an amusement park, servicing pinball machines and other electromechanical games.
I thought at the time, if I could take this game and put it in my arcades, so we can make a lot of money.
He had a vision. Computer space. Simply put, it was a way to get a Space War-like game into an arcade cabinet, and it would live right alongside the pinball machines. They used such an odd-looking cabinet that it wound up serving as a prop in science fiction movies.
Here, you better sign for him. My usual cut?
You'll get your cut.
Just so we understand.
I mean, it looked totally 60s with that kind of molded plastic or polystyrene, whatever the hell it was.
One day, this bulbous space-like thing showed up, and I just couldn't believe how much fun it was, and I wondered why there weren't a lot more of these things out there.
Computer space was too much, too soon. The controls were too complicated. People just didn't know how to play.
I think that what I didn't realize is that you didn't have to be complex to be fun. Keep it simple.
So next time, he kept it simple, and he got it right. Pong. Without a single button to push, Pong was not just easy to play, but it had a clear goal. Bounce the little square ball at your opponent, and your opponent bounces it back. The year was 1972. Bushnell and his partners, Ted Dabney and Al Alcorn, set up the first Pong machine at a bar in California's Silicon Valley. The next morning, they received their first complaint call. The Pong machine had broken. But Pong didn't break because they didn't build it right. It broke because people had forced so many quarters into it, it just jammed up. The first glitch in video game history was a coin box that was too small. Nobody made that mistake again.
And we thought, well, this is a good sign.
Within 12 months, a few guys taking out loans to make electronic toys became one of the richest companies in the world. But the competition did not take long to catch up. That same year, American engineer and inventor Ralph Baer introduced the first home video game console, the Odyssey.
It was very, very simple. You actually had to go to the package and pull out plastic overlay and rub it onto the TV set and hope it would stay there with static electricity, and if not, you had to tape it on with Scotch tape.
This is Odyssey, the new electronic game simulator. You attach Odyssey to your television set in seconds to create a closed-circuit electronic playground. Odyssey is tennis, roulette, football, and hockey. Odyssey comes complete with 12 electronic games and educational experiences.
Ralph Baer was a man ahead of his time, and way ahead of his manufacturing company, Magnavox, who had no idea how to market the Odyssey. The ads made consumers think that you needed a Magnavox television to run the device, which of course hindered sales. Home video games didn't really catch on until Nolan Bushnell decided to capitalize on the success of the Pong arcade game by releasing a home version in 1975.
My vice president called up Sears, so we thought, well, maybe, Pong's been in bars, pinballs, maybe that'll work. So he called up the buyer at Sears, described what we had, and literally he was at our front door the next morning, taking a midnight flyer. We went in and he played the game and he said, how many can you build? Well, we had no clue. I said, well, maybe 25,000 between now and Christmas. I went back in and I said 75,000. The next day he gave us a purchase order for 150,000. We were off to the races.
We played that thing to death. Just hooked up to the TV with a little simple black and white and the little bleep, bloop, bleep, bloop. So it was a very, very exciting moment. That was a great Christmas.
Magnavox and Baer sued Atari for stealing their ideas. It was just the first of thousands of video game-related lawsuits. But Atari won, encouraging rival manufacturers to surge into the market with their own clones of Pong.
You're watching the most exciting game you will ever see on your TV set. Telstar.
It was a simple game. It was also a pretty simple game to clone. I mean, we were manufacturing in a garage shop. That's all we had, so that was a good thing. Bad thing is that anybody else who had a garage shop could knock it off and build it too. Within 6 months, we had maybe 20 competitors. It was a little bit frustrating.
Let's see your best pitch.
To keep ahead of the game, Atari decided to release the VCS, one of the best-selling home consoles of all time.
You need more practice, Haley.
Despite the fame and fortune that lay in its future, the VCS was a commercial failure when it first launched in 1977.
You're out, Atari!
The video gaming public was more interested in the powerful processors and superior graphics found at the arcade, such as 1978's Space Invaders. Space Invaders wasn't an Atari product. It wasn't even an American product. The game immediately established the Japanese as a major player in the world of video games. In fact, it was so popular, it caused a national coin shortage in Japan. In America, it fit perfectly with an era that was obsessed with science and technology.
These are the voyages of the starship Enterprise.
Star Trek and Star Wars.
I actually think the primal beat, that here are aliens that are going to kill you. There was a adrenaline rush for fighting these aliens, as simple as it is to look at now.
But the game, is very easy to understand. It was great, very simple. It was better than Pong. This is cool,
Then there was, some strategy to it, and you're going to stay behind the barriers, you're going to shoot the aliens, that kind of having fun shooting things in a game. For what it was, it became a very, very different kind of shooting gallery, like you had never seen before.
Space Invaders also had a darker side. The fear of the unknown, the alien. The mindless enemy that descends on the planet with military precision. And no matter how long you can hold out, eventually, they're going to kill you. Perhaps the game resonated with the children of those who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japanese children who grew up fearing the foreign terror from the skies. Now, they had a way to fight back.
Our plan is a comprehensive one. It will strengthen and modernize the strategic triad of land-based missiles, sea-based missiles, and bombs.
Atari fights back and launches Missile Command and Asteroids. Despite advancements in graphics and gameplay, the core remained the same. Shoot anything that comes your way. In response to the violent games of the late 1970s, Toru Iwatani designed the most popular arcade game ever invented, Pac Man. For the first time, a video game was a brand. Pac Man appeared in every conceivable type of merchandise. He even starred in his own television show and was the subject of a top 40 pop song. Everyone was struck with Pac Man fever.
New Pac Man pasta from Chef Boyardee. With meatballs, without meatballs, or chicken flavored.
Thank goodness for new Pac Man pasta!
Pac Man was the opposite of doom and gloom. He just wanted lunch.
Pac Man was cutesy in an all-new way that could appeal to anybody. A little bit of a story there, and it was a different kind of gameplay than you had seen up to that point. And sort of the game that you could be a master of with the pattern recognition and where are the ghosts and how to maximize points. It really became a mild obsession of mine at the time.
What a crazy game idea. To me, that was like everything before that game. They're all about just shoot the alien. Everything was shoot the alien. Asteroids was, shoot the little alien and the asteroids. But, everything was just shoot, 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 shoot. So when Pac Man came out, it was like it had funny kind of music in it. It had a main character that was, just eating dots. It had nothing to do with killing things. In fact, you're running away from things. So it was like the opposite. To me, it just showed what the future of game design, the promise of game design could be.
And along came the clones and spin-offs. He was such a hit with the ladies that someone had the brilliant idea to stick a bow on him and call him Ms. Pac Man.
Don't you know I'm more than Pac Man with a bow?
Ms. Pac Man.
Namco wasn't amused. They sued Midway to protect their valuable property. But the suit was soon thrown out. There was far more money to be made by simply adopting Ms. Pac Man as their own. To this day, Pac Man remains one of the highest grossing arcade games of all time. And not for lack of competition. By the early 80s, there were arcades everywhere. And it wasn't just a kid's phenomenon.
Video games are the latest craze to sweep the country, but will this popularity last is the question. Well, the makers of video games are gambling that it will.
We have football knee, tennis elbow, jogger's ankle, so why not? Pac-Man's wrist.
The calluses and blisters are obvious. The links and the swelling is secondary.
Critics tried to spoil Pac-Man's fun. What about kids' valuable homework time? Where were kids really spending that lunch money? Arcade games invaded grocery stores, dentist offices, even funeral parlors.
The new Atari cartridge game is in.
Excuse me.
And of course, living rooms around the world. Nolan Bushnell had a head start with the Atari VCS already in stores. He was just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up with him. And soon enough, everybody wanted one.
Quel jour qu'elle dure cette réunion de famille? C'est leur ordinateur de jeu Atari.
Video games Atari. Roba da fantascienza.
Sales soared. Plus, Bushnell had something lots of his competitors did not. Money. In order to mass manufacture the Atari VCS, Bushnell sold Atari to media giant Warner Communications in 1977. The cutthroat corporate mindset took over at Atari, leading to Bushnell himself being forced out of the very company he created. To this day, he regrets the sale of Atari as the worst business decision he ever made.
They thought they could just keep producing games and they could treat the engineers like factory workers. They didn't really make the connection that they were the stars.
What specific games have you designed?
Well, at Atari, we don't really like to talk about who designed what.
Why not?
Well, because we like to make the game the superstar as opposed to the programmer.
Why shouldn't you get credit if you designed the game?
Well, because it is a corporate product. Okay, these are games by Atari, not games by Steve Wright or some other person.
And they said, we want to be treated like rock stars. We want to get royalties on the games we produce, which was unheard of. And Atari said, that's very nice, but this is a toy company and we make games and you work for us and this is the only system that you have the ability to program for, so go back to your cubes and make more games.
So naturally, we added up all the games that we had done in that group and realized that the four of us, out of the 30-person department, were responsible for 60% of the sales of Atari for that previous year.
It became obvious to the most casual observer because you could see that you were building cartridges for $3 and selling them for 20, that somebody was making a whole bunch of money. There were 4 million cartridges, 8 million cartridges, 10 million cartridges sold. These are engineers. They can do math pretty well.
The sales of Atari in the previous year was $100 million. And so we're looking at each other, and so we're making $20,000 a year, and we're generating $60 million of revenues.
Atari didn't really control its marketplace the way manufacturers do today with their licensing programs. Well, they went back to their cubes and left and started a company called Activision.
Atari tried its best to stifle the onslaught of competition, but the judges ruled that you could plug whatever you wanted into that cartridge slot.
Activision prevailed and went from zero to, I think, $60 or $70 million in about 18 months. The guys that left Atari were the key programmers.
It was just natural that the best and the brightest would move across the street to Activision, and then shortly thereafter, another bunch of them left. And so Atari sort of got left with the guys who couldn't move.
It's heavy! I found the way to the gold!
Atari lost control of its marketplace. Didn't have this gated garden like Apple has with the iPhone, and then everybody saw the opportunity and piled in. I mean, you succeeded by dumb luck half the time. Ending, and it was total chaos.
This was no clearer than in Atari's 1982 version of the much-loved arcade game, Pac Man. Atari spent millions to acquire the license to make the game. It became the all-time bestseller for the system. But their rushed production only mocked Iwatani's masterpiece. Later that same year, Steven Spielberg's E.T. landed in theaters. Warner executives spent a fortune for the rights to make the game an Atari exclusive. They pushed the production team to finish the game in time for Christmas, giving them just 6 weeks to complete production.
I saw the game plan, a very rough scheme of the game, and I was amazed at how difficult it was, and yet at the same time how much fun it was to play.
But with all the hype aside, the result was a game even more underwhelming than Pac Man. A million people rushed out to buy it. And almost as many returned it the next day. Pac Man and E.T. were indeed groundbreaking. But the real ground broken was for a landfill in New Mexico. Atari buried millions of unsold units. And these games were just the high-profile tip of the garbage pile.
We used to go to CES in Chicago every year, the big trade show. And one year we went there and everybody and his brother was doing video games. All of a sudden there were 30 video game companies, where the previous year there were 2. And it got to the point where even Quaker Oats had a video game booth. And we looked at all the games being done by these 30 companies who had no experience doing games, and so these games are horrible. All these companies are going to be out of business in a few months, which was true. But what happens when you have 30 companies going out of business and they all have 1 million cartridges in their inventory? They dump them on the market.
There may be trouble in Toyland, at least in the video games division. This week, industry giant Warner Communications, makers of Atari, announced that 1982 earnings would be far below previous expectations.
By 1983, it seemed as though the public's love affair with arcade games was coming to an end.
In a 12-month period, there was almost a 90% decrease in the revenues at arcades.
The manufacturers didn't know what to do with all those cartridges.
An enterprising liquidator went around to these companies and said, you know, you've got all those cartridges in the warehouse, and you paid, $20, $30 to have them built. I'll give you $3 each. And the bankruptcy judge says, well, they're worth nothing to me otherwise. In fact, I have to pay to get rid of them. So he took them for $3 each. Then he goes to the retailers and said, I'm going to sell them to you for $4, and you can retail them for $5. And the guy says, that's a pretty good margin. It's not too bad, really, when it comes right down to it. So for one Christmas, the crash Christmas, there were 20 million pieces of software for sale at $5 a piece in barrels just inside the door of Toys R Us. So even though a kid asks for the latest, hottest $40 Activision title for Christmas, Dad takes his $40 into the store, and he says, I can buy 8 games for my $40. I'm going to be the hero. And he buys 8 $5 games, and in one Christmas, the sale of brand new frontline titles went to 0.
One of the things that we take for granted now is that video games are part of our lives. They are part of our culture. They're part of what we think of as media. In about 1983-84, video games were being dismissed as being like the hula hoop or Cabbage Patch Dolls or the hustle. Toy stores went from featuring video games as one of their biggest profit centers to saying, this is over, what's next? We simply reached that point where the initial flush of romance was lost, and nobody realized that this was a long-term relationship.
In hindsight, it's easy to see how Atari brought computers into our everyday lives, and how Bushnell's efforts forged a long-term relationship between people and their machines.
We saw the personal computer through the game business eyes, and we saw it being a super game player, and yeah, if it wanted to do word processing, some of that other stuff, yeah, that'd be okay as well.
I'm going to come to you mostly through this medium here.
But back in 1968, almost 10 years before the Atari VCS, Doug Engelbart demonstrated a prototypical modern-day computer environment. It had familiar features such as email, hyperlinks, and even video conferencing.
Hi, Bill. That's great.
All of it was driven by an amazingly simple device known as the mouse.
The concept of a desktop computer really didn't exist. The early computers you bought in pieces. The fact that you could get this box to turn a light on was, hey, this is new. We've never turned a light on using this electronics before. It's that kind of excitement of uncovering what, when you put these pieces together, when you put these electronics together, what can you actually make them do?
In the 1970s, home computers were nothing more than an obscure hobby. These do-it-yourself computer marvels had no real operating systems, requiring programmers to communicate via machine language. This made them almost unusable to the general public. It wasn't until 1977 that home computers finally became easier to operate. A new term was introduced into our lexicon: user-friendly.
The two Steves, Wozniak and Jobs, what a lot of people don't realize is that Steve Jobs worked for Atari and actually did Breakout and did a great job on it. And when they decided to do the Apple computer, they came and asked if we wanted to produce it. We didn't feel like we could use our capital at that point in time because we had all the business that we could use. And at the same time, they offered me a third of Apple computer for $50,000, which in my brilliance I turned down.
Introducing Apple II, the easy-to-operate home computer.
Kind of regret that one.
Your TV to create dazzling color displays. Or you can balance your checkbook. Or the family can invent their own Pong games. The possibilities are endless.
I still remember the shock of that moment, the time when I first saw an Apple II, which is this little flat, low-lying machine with a keyboard built in and very simple monitor with it. I realized this thing has more power in it than the room-sized computer that I've been writing games on at that point for probably 7 years. Kept looking at it and saying, how did they get an entire room worth of hardware into this little thing?
You walk into the store and it smells all clean, plasticky, and there are like 3 Apple IIs there with color monitors and just baggies hanging on the walls, right? Just Ziploc bags with all these games. You know, they didn't take up much space because they're just like hanging off the walls.
But the games were compatible only with the specific computer model they were created for. Confusion, frustration, and brand loyalty followed.
Nobody compares to Atari.
I find Intellivision more sophisticated and lifelike. Gentlemen, Move over.
Users would swear that their brand was the best one.
This is the one.
There was so much diversity in terms of platforms, the retailers couldn't decide which PC or console to support. The publishing community couldn't determine which system you were going to program for because there were small companies, you know, there's 20, 30 employees. There's not the massive studios that they have today producing multi-million-dollar, you know, productions. There's a handful of hobbyists, really. And so you always had to guess.
Home computers utilized floppy disks or cassette tapes instead of the fast-loading cartridges used for gaming consoles. That meant it was cheaper to buy software, but the software ran much slower.
You'd wait 20 minutes for the game to load, and then you make a left turn instead of a right, and boom, you were dead. So now you had to reload the game again because it didn't stay in memory.
Despite all the waiting around, floppy disks and cassette tapes actually contributed greatly to the development of home computers as gaming devices. Unlike cartridges, the discs and tapes could be easily copied and freely traded as homebrew games among networks of devoted video gamers. A new chapter of the gaming culture was unfolding. What was known as level editing became a popular hobby. Influential games started being developed by lone designers in their bedrooms. The basement coders.
I come home from school, computer straight on. And it was, you know, I told my parents that this was for school. No, it was to figure out how to make games. It was a total lie, just like most people at the time. Start typing these pages and pages of codes from magazines in to just see what happens. Understanding why one thing that you've got in this area of the code makes this thing happen on screen.
You gave people very simple tools to create their own world. People flocked to that. It's a powerful mechanic.
A new mindset was taking shape. User-generated content. Some of the most popular games in early PCs had no graphics at all. Text-based adventure games like 1977's Zork were played by typing in commands from a keyboard. But the lack of graphics was made up for with challenging puzzles and immersive stories.
Zork 1 is text on screen. You type in a sentence, you could actually type in a whole sentence, but it was really just parsing for the verb and the noun. And once it found the verb and the noun, it would figure out what you were trying to do, and it would go to a database and see whether you could accomplish it. You would try to find a way to advance through the story and advance through the rooms by solving these puzzles.
Really appealed to the demographic of who were buying and owning computers at that time. They were like the cutting-edge thing that you could do with a personal computer.
Publishers had great success with text adventures. These are now known as role-playing games, RPGs. Inspired by the classic game, Dungeons & Dragons.
In Dungeons & Dragons, you would basically have a dungeon master telling you a story, and then as a player, you would just imagine what your next events would be. And then just the roll of the dice would sort of determine the end results. Out of that came the idea to translate that into text on computers, and people, embraced those.
Teenage hobbyist game developer Richard Garriott brought role-playing to the desktop. In 1981, his influential game franchise, Ultima, was born. Ultima introduced gameplay mechanics still enjoyed today by tens of millions of gamers. These RPGs were not casual like Pong or Space Invaders. It took days or even weeks of play to travel from dungeon to dungeon, claiming treasure, buying new weapons, building your character, into a mighty warrior.
Adventure games are probably the ultimate archetype for video games. You could maybe say that all kinds of games are adventure games to a certain extent. But yeah, adventure games, I think, is like the heart of this medium.
When you say an adventure game, it's sort of just one mechanic, which is navigating your way through an environment, point and click. It's very story-driven.
Video games slowly started presenting more elaborate game worlds for gamers to explore. The focus was not on the speed of the player, but on immersing them in an alternate version of reality. Adventure games left another huge mark on the development of computer technology. Games like Zork were the first games that could be played on multiple platforms. The simple concept of separating software from hardware was very influential in the development of personal computers. Once there was a unified operating system, PC sales exploded. More units were sold in 1981 than in the previous 5 years combined.
We shall prevail.
That number almost doubled in 1982. In the next 30 years, hundreds of new hardware and software companies emerged.
But YouTube has fast become must-see.
They went from obscurity to fame over a very short period of time. Very similar to how Google rose.
The computing industry that first came into our homes with the Atari had slowly grown to become a necessity.
That's what it looks like.
This is gonna be so cool.
What does the rest of my day look like?
The relationship between man and software had now evolved from user-friendly to lifestyle. Though back in 1985, it's not fair to say that home computers simply picked up where video game consoles had left off. Investors and retailers had lost tens of millions of dollars during the video game crash, and no one would invest as much as a quarter in that sort of business. But there was Mario. In Japan, home consoles were still selling strong, particularly ones made by a playing card company named Nintendo. No stranger to gamers, Nintendo had scored in 1981 with Shigeru Miyamoto's arcade classic, Donkey Kong. Because of the restrictions of technology, Miyamoto needed to get creative with Mario's design. As there were not enough bytes available to create a passable head of hair, he gave him a hat. Same with the mustache. Without the facial hair, the Mario sprite would have looked weird.
When you want to attach your name to a world record, when you want your name written into history, you have to pay the price.
Donkey Kong's gameplay was designed with such perfection that even films have been made to celebrate its beauty. Now, Nintendo took on the challenge of exporting its popular console to America. American retailers, still reeling from the crash Christmas of 1983, wanted nothing to do with another video game console. But Nintendo managed to infiltrate America with the help of Rob, the robotic operating buddy. Rob would actually play your video games with you. Nintendo had tricked retailers into thinking that they were not the bearers of another gaming console. but fancy electronic toy manufacturer. Nintendo's real secret weapon turned out to be Super Mario Bros. A spectacular game that eventually came bundled with the system. Our Donkey Kong hero was back, but with much, much more power. Super Mario Bros. Did for console gaming what Pac Man had done for the arcades. It gave gamers, and more importantly, retailers, a reason to get excited about video games all over again.
Well, Nintendo figured out from the ashes of what went on previously, you need to control this business and you need to extract royalties for people to play on your system, as opposed to just having this free range where everybody can come in and drop a game into the marketplace.
When people bought a Nintendo game, they knew it would have some level of quality control. Nintendo made sure to produce all the actual cartridges itself, incorporating a special authentication chip in every console and cartridge to prevent piracy. With popular franchises, clever marketing, and a tight control policy, Nintendo wrote many of the much-needed rules for the rest of the video game industry to follow. Fresh competition like Sega and old-timers like Atari tried hard, but no one could loosen Nintendo's grip on the industry. Nintendo was huge, making more money than all the previous gaming systems combined. And to stay huge, they thought small. Introducing the Nintendo Game Boy in 1989.
You don't stop playing because you get old, but you could get old if you stop playing.
With its monochrome graphics, blurry screen, and tinny sound, it's hard to say that the Game Boy was a technological marvel. In fact, the competition, like Atari's Lynx and Sega's Game Gear, had far more power. Much like the NES, the Game Boy had a secret weapon, too. Tetris, the killer app of mobile gaming. It was something the competition lacked, and over 30 million gamers could not live without.
You could see secretaries playing Tetris. They might not think you were seeing them play it, but you walked in and you looked at their computer screen and they were playing it.
Tetris didn't come from Japan or America. It came from behind the Iron Curtain. Created by Alexei Pajitnov, a Russian computer engineer, Tetris was developed while he worked for the Soviet government. The game was leaked out of Russia, and nobody could keep track of who owned the copyrights.
At a time which was a little bit Wild West of the early video game industry, who owned it and who had the rights on a particular platform, all of those laws hadn't really been defined for this business because this business was just starting.
Several companies claimed to have the exclusive rights to produce Tetris, prompting Atari and Nintendo into a war. Even though Atari's version was stolen first, Nintendo's lawyers shut it down. The big loser, however, was Pajitnov himself. The Soviet government owned the rights to his program and never gave him a ruble. But at least he got to be the first person in history to play Tetris while he was supposed to be working. With video games now everywhere, one would expect to see something special if they wandered into an arcade. In 1983, when the home console market was falling to pieces, a new arcade game was launched with a visual achievement that far surpassed the sprite-based graphics of every other game on the market. Dragon's Lair.
I remember seeing Dragon's Lair and not really being able to understand what it was because it looked like a movie.
You immediately had a crowd of people around it going, ooh, what's that, what's this?
This video game featured state-of-the-art laserdisc technology, which awed players with striking hand-drawn video clips within the gameplay. The laserdisc established a new paradigm. Dragon's Lair devoured coins at top speed.
50 cents at the time was a lot. I still remember being like, hey, this game is double everything else. But of course, it was so pretty at the time. You're like, okay, it's worth it.
With graphics this sexy, it didn't even matter that the gameplay was so poor.
Of course, it had some issues because then I played it, and you die immediately if you don't flick the controller to the left or right or wherever you're trying to go in that castle that never seemed to end. But it really opened everybody's eyes to the possibility of like what you really could do with video games.
The game's technical ingenuity earned it a place in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. Featured there alongside Dragon's Lair are two other industry beacons, Pac Man and, of course, Pong. Alongside the Laserdisc, moving cabinets also kept people interested in the arcades.
Video game developers really had to sort of go back to the drawing board and think of new ways, new cabinet styles, new games, new gameplay experiences.
Japanese game designer Yu Suzuki made his mark with an array of simulators that became star attractions in arcades worldwide. His masterpiece, 1986's Outrun, offered gamers their choice of both soundtrack and route. Beyond a simple racing game, Suzuki provided players an actual driving experience.
As soon as you sit in a car that will move with you, will give you that sensation, all of a sudden it is a full body experience. So the evolution of Outrun in that full body immersion is now what we're seeing with motion control games and all the rest of it.
Years later, Dance Dance Revolution would transcend arcade play and even make its way into physical education classes in thousands of US schools.
Just take those old records on the shelf.
Then came the game that made us all rock stars, Guitar Hero.
Got the same song. I like that old timer.
You pick up a guitar, and you hold different buttons based on what's on the screen, and you strum. Anybody can do that. And it's great, because now you have people who were always traditionally, oh, I'm not a gamer, I don't play video games, and suddenly, 2 hours later, they're completely hooked.
Even the Beatles got in the game.
Somebody says, here's a plastic guitar with some colored keys, rock out to your favorite songs. No, I'm not going to do that. Oh my God, is this fun?
Another big spectacle in the arcades was the competitive fury of fighting games. 1991 Street Fighter II tantalized gamers by letting them hurricane kick, tiger knee, and dragon punch their smack-talking buddies into submission. To this day, it ranks only behind Pac Man and Space Invaders in the amount of revenue it's generated. And whenever there is that kind of money, there are sure to be copycats. For all of the clones that tried their hand at this market, the one that drew the most blood was Mortal Kombat. You don't just knock out your opponents, you knock off their heads and rip out their spinal cords. The gore absolutely awed children, but shocked their parents.
I love to rip someone's head off with their spine, and I thought it was like the coolest thing ever. Of course, as soon as the press got wind of it, there was all sorts of negativity about it.
The controversy created a perfect political storm in 1993.
This is a handgun, pure and simple. And putting it in the hands of a kid just gives them The wrong idea.
The congressional hearings on violence in video games received wide coverage in the mainstream media.
There is a serious problem here, a real serious problem. I hope you walk away with one thought today, that if you don't do something about it, we will.
The hearings eventually led to the creation of the industry's standard rating board, set up to regulate content, rating it to an appropriate age range. But in the same year as the congressional hearings, the PC game Doom exploded on the scene, adding more fuel to the fire. The violence was immersive and personal, and the experience was transferred to the first-person perspective. Gamers got their first glimpse of a truly virtual reality. But even though you played an assassin, Doom was actually a social game.
People were starting to basically bring their computers over to other people's houses on the weekends, and they called that the LAN party. So lots of LAN cards in cable were being sold like crazy. They were selling so much of this stuff because now network gaming was really here. LAN parties got to be really big. Everybody was creating their machines. The lobby would come up and you'd see everyone in the lobby and you would instigate a game with them, and basically you got connected to them over the modem with someone that you just met through this server.
That was kind of our first glimpse as to what the power of social networking was going to eventually become later in the industry.
So many developers cloned Doom's formula that an entire genre of first-person shooters appeared. Franchises like Call of Duty and Halo still dominate today, grossing billions of dollars. The look and the sound continue to improve with each generation, but the basic game remained the same. A killing simulator. These two games became the shorthand for everything that was wrong with video games.
Doom and Mortal Kombat got so much negative feedback in the press, and when Myst came out, it sold more copies of any game than pretty much anything else the time had, and it was completely nonviolent.
You know, the game of the year has always been a board game, and this year it's not.
The CD-ROM game Myst sold over 1 million copies.
The point of it wasn't to shoot anybody in the head or to escape from a dungeon. The point was really to just give yourself over to the game.
Myst was just gorgeous. The visual quality was just so epic and so immersive. And the gameplay required you to appreciate that. And so those games, even though they were a slower pace, they engaged you by way of thinking.
The game would not have been possible without the newly emergent CD-ROM, an evolution of the Laserdisc technology, but 1/4 the size.
CD-ROMs were one of the most stunning advances that we had in technology. In one fell swoop, we had about a 100-fold increase in storage space, and suddenly, to our horror, we realized that we were going to have to fill all that storage to be competitive.
You guys, you gotta help me, please. Use the traps.
To stand out, game developers started producing cheap video clips to include in the gameplay. An unfortunate side effect of having all that disk space to fill and so little knowledge about video production. Games like Doom and Myst revealed a huge gap between PC and console gaming. All of the exciting 3D games were on the PC. That was until Sony released the PlayStation. Sony took full advantage of the CD-ROM, Not by packing the discs with substandard video clips, but with impressive three-dimensional game worlds. Within a few years, the PlayStation would come with a controller designed specifically for 3D gaming. Sony put all of their stock behind the 3D experience.
The jump to 3D was a big deal. You translated the 2D platformers into 3D. That was a scary proposition. It brought in all kinds of technical problems that couldn't even conceive of before you actually got there. The whole concept of where the camera is suddenly became a question. There was no question of where the camera was before that. Where's the camera gonna be? Where's it gonna go? How's it gonna get from one to the other? Every game has a camera wrestling match throughout the entire development.
The investment paid off with 1996's Tomb Raider. It combined a mesmerizing game world with a brand new video game icon, Lara Croft.
The character doesn't alienate women, it actually has quite a female following. A lot of the female gamers can appreciate how, yeah, she's very stylish and she's very sexy, but she is not presenting herself as a sex object. She does not use her sexuality as a tool. She does not talk to men in the games in any kind of coquettish fashion. She's strong, she's independent, she's self-motivated. In fact, she's a bitch. That's part of the fantasy, is being able to do more than you really could do.
Everything was scaled around her. Her jumps, her reach. You knew with certainty in Tomb Raider where you could jump, how high you could jump. Everything was worked out in terms of squares.
I'd finally set out to make my mark. To find adventure. But instead, adventure found me.
I still think that the Tomb Raider games that they're releasing now are really good. It's got legs, that franchise, you know, very shapely legs, I guess.
The new generation of video games was breathtaking. The game worlds enabled by 3D technology were absolute game changers. Enter the open world. A series that took full advantage of the open-ended free-roaming environment was Grand Theft Auto.
Free roaming sort of gives the player the ability to just go anywhere and do anything. A lot of games, you're always on a path. And even though you sort of feel like you have the ability to go left or right, you're still sort of on a path that gets you from point A to point B, so you can go from one story point to the next. An open world game, you do feel like, wow, I have a choice. It really ties back into that very notion of interactivity, where you are the dungeon master in this world.
Grand Theft Auto is a virtual playground that lets you do what you've always wanted to do. It lets you be the crazy guy in an action movie. It lets you be the badass dude who owns the club. You can get to a point where you piss off so much of the city that they're sending SWAT teams and then the National Guard after you. Who doesn't want to do that? It was one of the first video games that really let you do what you want to do.
People who don't play video games or parents view any video game as a child's toy. So when they hear, do you know there's a video game where you kill policemen? Oh my God. My answer to that is, when was the golden age of peace? that media destroyed.
But how can a simple video game be so controversial?
It causes such a heightened reaction because it takes you away from just reading something or watching something into actually participating in it.
As in any other media, there is always a place for transgression, a means to explore the consciousness of the sociopathic and the mentally ill. In 2005, an independent programmer released a game centered around the events of the 1999 Columbine massacre. The gameplay involves listening to Marilyn Manson, drinking vodka, and playing Doom. The role of video games in our society was being challenged. We can read books about Columbine, watch Columbine, but can we also play Columbine?
There's always a place for it. It's a free society, so you can always build something, and people are going to want to play stuff like that. And who says you shouldn't?
Mr. Loeffner will spend the remainder of his natural life in prison.
One video game after the other, shooting.
At Jonesboro, Columbine, Virginia Tech. What happened in Connecticut? This is a sick culture.
Video games have bent the status quo just as much as any art form has done in the past. But in the case of the 2006 game Rape-Lay, even the United Nations got involved and asked for a ban.
Well, it's certainly hard to believe that anyone would equate rape with entertainment, but that is just what game makers in Japan have done.
This one, called Rape-Lay, begins with a teenage girl on a subway platform. With a click of your mouse, you can grope her and lift her skirt.
These sort of games that normalize extreme sexual violence against women and girls have really no place in our communities.
It's Adam and Eve kind of a thing. God said, don't take the apple. Okay, but why? What about the apple?
I do think that game developers have a kind of personal responsibility to think about the violence and how they depict it in their games.
We're here for a long overdue checkup.
One example, I worked on a recent serious game called Remission that is helping kids with cancer stick with their treatment regimen.
Let's do this. All right. Now you're cooking.
Any more?
And it's written specifically for teenagers to help them understand what's going on in their body as they're going through their cancer treatment. You have to see the internal effects of dehydration, the problem of growing cancer colonies. The missions are all medically themed and all that. Kids who played this game took better care of themselves than the kids who didn't play the game. So it's using games as a way for social change.
Social change is also the goal of Darfur is Dying, which takes place in a refugee and displaced persons camp in Sudan. The players learn about some of the real-world challenges that over 2.5 million refugees are experiencing in Darfur. As ways of reducing the virtual attack threats by Sudanese militia, gamers are welcome to sign on to a petition to the President of the United States.
Just the simplest game done by a handful of students with, next to nothing budget. And yet it was just really effective, sort of connecting the dots in a way that just reading about the situation doesn't.
The most controversial games get the most attention, but in reality, the games that keep players playing for the most amount of time are the ones that cater to our nurturing instincts, like the mind-boggling Tamagotchis.
Well, mine sleeps like a little angel.
And here's a completely non-combative, blood-free, adorable Japanese craze that sort of set fire here in the US. It was at a time before mobile phones, and it was this little, tiny device you could carry on your pocket, and you had to keep this creature alive. Mine would always die after like 4 or 5 days, and it always pissed me off, because I'm like, I fed you, I cleaned up your poop, I watered you, and you died. Like, what the hell?
You couldn't just play it and then put it down. When you think about Tamagotchi, it really was kind of the first mobile social game that really captured young people's attention.
Tomatown is making more room for fun.
The idea that you had to continually feed and take care of your Tamagotchi is now relied upon and makes millions and millions of dollars.
The concept was carried several steps further in 1999 with The Sims, the top-selling computer game of all time. The Sims gave the player an entire family to take care of.
It's the idea of being able to emulate what happens in your day-to-day life and sort of put it out there into a virtual world or a fantasy version of yourself. And that's really compelling.
It hit a wide range of people that you wouldn't necessarily refer to as gamers. It was something that you would get invested in. You'd have your family of Sims, and you would want to take care of them, and you'd want to level them up, and you'd want to make sure they have, all their needs are taken care of, and you'd try to work and check in often to make sure that their mood was happy.
Jeep, Johnny Safasim, Z?
Verga. Chambi Lorkna Chenji. Jeep Nadora.
Role-playing games. What is it about it that kept people playing week after week after week after week? And it was this always earning something mentality. Every single thing you did had an impact, and you were rewarded over it.
Chat.
When the game reinvented itself as a Facebook application in 2011, it gave players the ability to interact with millions of other players in the game world.
In comes the internet, and now the playing field is level again.
A new term was coined: social gaming.
Once we made that transition, and Facebook was a huge player in this, suddenly you had 800 million people playing games. Suddenly you took games from being something that existed for kids in a basement to suddenly just being something that everybody understood and could interact with.
And then there's Farmville, the 2D farming simulator. Much like Tamagotchi, Farmville requires players to constantly check in at specific times to maximize game results. If you plant a crop at 1 o'clock, you'd better be near a computer at 9 o'clock for the harvest.
You could play 10 minutes, but if you just played another 2 minutes, you'd be able to get the next achievement.
Zynga Games released Farmville as a free Facebook application in 2009. It quickly built a franchise of over 250 million users playing free-to-play games all over the world.
Free-to-play is a vastly burgeoning area of the whole video game space. Free-to-play, why would we create this game and give it away for free? Little incremental steps that this is only going to cost 50 cents or this is just $1. And all of a sudden, you've got a game that, yes, you played for free, and your credit card statement says, wow, I just spent $700. The designers have figured out a way to game the gamer, to get them to come back and also share with as many people as possible by offering these little tricks of rewards. It's all about getting as many users spending as much money incrementally for their shareholders. The cost of games now at that AAA level that you need to sell those numbers is getting into 9 figures.
Zynga really did an amazing job at really taking just massive amounts of data and really understanding what players do and then being able to work with that data in a live testing pool. When you have millions and millions of people interacting with something, you're able to see in real time what people are doing. People will respond to this game differently, and you can actually see actual numbers and numbers being translated into dollars, and you can see the reaction in real time.
Video game designers are behaviorists, focusing on learning, predicting, and reverse engineering the gamer's next move. The goal is to get rid of manuals or instructions altogether, getting rid of anything that takes the gamer out of the zone. If the game is too easy, the gamer gets bored. If it's too hard, the gamer gets frustrated. But if the engineering is just right, the desired state of immersion is achieved.
The goal of any video game is to provide the most fun, enthralling, and completely addictive experience.
That sense of being there in the moment.
What hooks are we putting in to make sure that they keep coming back?
There's a goal, there's an objective, you receive something back. It keeps people investing because they actually feel like what they do matters.
Manageable results, clear rules, goals to be conquered, complete engagement. And no video game genre has more addicted fans than the massive multiplayer online role-playing games, the MMOs. Starting from the first major success of Richard Garriott's Ultima Online, his adventure world-playing game combined the old Dungeon Master game idea with the connective power of the internet.
MMOs are not necessarily just about the game itself. It's all about socializing with your friends.
And this is people all over the country, all over the world even. So I can play with family in England. And as much as we might be playing the game, what's actually brought me in there is the social element.
There's been couples that have met each other online, or people that just find a community that they don't have in their real world where they can connect with people through playing games online.
The most popular MMO is World of Warcraft, a mega hit with more than 10 million subscribers. Their collective total of hours played amounts to more than 6 million years. That's more time than it took the human species to evolve.
World of Warcraft has this horrible option where you can type /played, and it will tell you how many hours that you've put into this character. And that is by far one of the most depressing things you can do in life. When you look and it says 340 hours, and you're going, wait, that's how many weeks, how many months, how many social events, how many things have I missed now? But then you're like, wait, my character looks really badass. There's like flame coming from the sword, and she can cast fireballs, and you're like, wait, it's like your gamer sense of pride mixes with your real life sense of, oh crap, I'm single and I'm a big video game nerd.
Thanks to specialized transaction and sale-based websites, the time spent in making virtual gold can be turned into real-world dollars.
Looking back on it, it seems obvious, but at the time, we didn't think people would spend, $200, $300 for a virtual sword. Well, they did. This led to a problem called farming, which is when people play the game over and over to get a specific item and then try to sell it.
Gaming sweatshops proliferate in places like Indonesia, China, and Mexico, with underpaid workers performing monotonous in-game tasks.
Well, people play games for a lot of reasons. You can get people who play a game and they play it a lot, but they're not necessarily having fun. They're playing it because there's something obsessive about it, and they want to complete it. And there's a certain reward factor to that. We often separate the concepts of reward and fun. The reward can be a very Pavlov kind of situation. It triggers your brain in a way that you really find rewarding. But it's not the same thing as having a good time.
After spending so much time in the game world, gamers may find themselves struck with a certain sense of shame, an arresting sense of emptiness and waste when one considers all the other things that could have been done with their game time. Some gamers report having gone into shock when they discover that they spent an entire month of the year in their game world.
Are clinically proven now game addictions, that they actually have, people going through therapy because they get so immersed into the games that they play. They do lose a little bit of reality.
Getting that quest, getting that next item is more important. And suddenly, they work so they come back and play WoW. They go to school so that they can come back and play WoW. It's probably the aspect of their life that they have the most control over. The piece of their life that they look forward to most.
Are you feeling unfulfilled, bored with life on Earth? What would you say to a new life filled with adventure, where you can live out your dreams and claim your fortune? We can give you that new life inside Project Entropia.
In the MMO Entropia universe, users interact with the help of a full-fledged cash economy.
Everything that you do within that world costs money, but you actually earn money for anything that you own. Supply and demand. If you have an asteroid, people want to go to visit that asteroid. They want to go and meet up there with their friends. They can sponsor parties, like virtual parties there, and there'll be certain creatures that you'll want to interact with. So when you buy that asteroid, the only way to get there is you have to pay a tax to take a shuttle there. And then once you're there, very sort of micro-transaction orientated. But how does it work? It's because that asteroid actually drives revenue. I have a friend who actually bought an asteroid for $100,000. Everybody thought he was crazy. 4 years later, he sold it for $600,000. Made an entire career generating a real-life income out of it.
And there is Second Life. There are no universal rewards or points, no bad guys to beat or missions to accomplish, just an easily customizable representation of life. Many talented artists host gallery exhibits. Bands play live shows. Colleges and even mainstream businesses have a presence. It's not much of a game at all. It's just a place to hang out, a place to be. As more and more real-world representations have crossed over into gameplay dynamics, the games have also crossed back into real life.
In the way that Generation G is different from X, Y, and all the different generations that we may belong to, is that video games are the primary form of entertainment that Generation G is consuming. It is their primary form of entertainment. And this is already starting to have a tremendous effect on society. All around us, Generation G's desire for game-like experiences is reshaping industries.
Suddenly, gamification became sort of, an interesting idea. Now we can gamify anything. If you just start checking in, that sort of became the easiest way to sort of collect points. And then you can suddenly turn those things in. You can get a discount, coupon. That's a game. You can go into corporations, give them virtual rewards, which then becomes real currency that they can possibly turn in. That's gamification. When you start thinking it from that lens, suddenly everything you do has an objective and a goal and reward to it. And if you just use a device, you attach a device to it or an application to it, it's gamified.
It's called WeHab. Hospitals like St. Mary's in San Francisco are using the WeFit video game for physical rehab.
Technology was something that people feared or they couldn't afford it, but now those barriers have sort of come down and it's much more personal for people. The demographics has really shifted in the past 5 years. With the advent of the Wii, it really changed everything.
It's sold to people that never had a video game controller. Organizations that would never ordinarily say, yes, I'm going to apply some budget to a video game console, all of a sudden, they've got a Wii in there because it's getting their audiences active, moving, and immersed.
And then you look at the Kinect, which allowed people to interact with a video game by moving around. So if you think about what are the next levels of that, brainwaves, right? Why not?
There's devices out there that you can put on your head and they'll read your brain waves. You can actually, don't even have to use a controller. It can actually understand through the heat in certain parts of your brain what you're actually trying to do on screen. So you can manipulate pixels on screen just by thinking about it.
Those kinds of like body metric measuring games are very rudimentary, so it's not a completely immersive experience. But I think it's something that game makers are definitely thinking about. The Kinect can even measure your breathing. There's a Deepak Chopra video game.
Leela is a journey of mind and body.
It's a meditation game.
There are 7 chakras, which are energy centers within each of us. Gentle motion is all that is needed to awaken the chakras.
And I don't see that stopping, especially when you think about augmented reality and wearing glasses.
Yeah. Meet me in front of Strand Books at 2.
The videos that Google's released for their glasses, they're very practical. You know, you're walking along and, hey, you're walking to this location.
Oh man, really?
And hey, my friend just tweeted this, and my friend just texted that, and my other friend had just checked in on Foursquare over here. And suddenly it's this very practical thing that brings in all these applications that we're already doing anyway on our phone, except that you can still walk and not walk into a car while you're interacting with your world.
Welcome.
Society's massive interest in technology suggests it might be only a matter of time before we embrace the notion of reality augmentation.
Chips are so small now that you can probably start putting things into cells. That becomes a way to try to understand disease and actually do something good. But there's always the entertainment aspect. What can people do to actually play around with that to create something that people will want to buy for entertainment? It's like super exciting to sort of think about the science fiction of everything. That's where I started going, yeah, you know, like it starts getting, you can start thinking of all the crazy sort of maybe dark things you could do with that.
A world where anything is possible.
There definitely is this possibility that we are going to be living in some sort of Matrix-like virtual world where our brainwaves and activities could be measured, and that way there is no interface.
There is only one way to enter the Matrix.
We're in.
If you have the chance to go there, to go to these different places in this virtual world, yeah, that'd be great. And that's a pretty good way of spending some time, I think. As AI gets better and better, it makes all of those interactions much more believable.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
ID.
KPC 897504C.
Can you move your head?
And so you get that sense that, you know, a character that you see in a game
Your eyes now.
is somebody that you kind of feel like you know or that you have a relationship with.
Cervical and optical.
That kind of recognition, if that happens,
give me your initial...
unbelievably freaky. First few times it happens, but how cool is that?
I can look after your house, do the cooking, mind the kids. I organize your appointments. I speak 300 languages, and I am entirely at your disposal as a sexual partner. No need to feed me or recharge me. I'm equipped with a quantic battery that makes me autonomous for 173 years. Do you want to give me a name?
People will always point towards the negative and say, oh, but see, there's something that's being lost, when actually, when you look at the percentages of what people are actually using games for more and more so now, which is communicating, connecting with people from all over the world, it's like, well, what's being gained?
Could the human species exist in a digital universe of its own design? At what point does the game end? Could the line between humans and machines fade away forever?